You talked about the top 6 risks facing South Africa: state collapse, debt crisis, collapse of services and public infrastructure, cost of living crisis, employment and livelihood crises, and illegal immigration. That's another whole thesis and another MBA and another whole term to discuss. I'd like us just to focus in on state collapse and on the collapse of services and public infrastructure. And if you could give us some ideas of how do we as business face those 2 risks?
So first, I think we need to accept that it ought to look different in order to break the cycle. The cycle that 29 years into democracy, poverty still has primarily a black and feminine face. That if wealth is the inevitable outcome of both hard work and enterprise, then every woman in Africa should be a millionaire. That more gender equal societies are more peaceful societies. That we celebrate the fact that we've got the best constitution in the world, not because of what's contained in the main body of our constitution, all 198 sections, but in the one pager, which is just the preamble to our constitution, because it picks up from the 27th of June, 1955 in clip down, called the Freedom Charter, 10 principles. The 5th principle talks about the land shall belong to those who work it. But that we chose to be different from the way we were managed in the 48 years of apartheid, 98 years of separate development, 370 years of colonialism. And this preamble starts with the beautiful words, "we the people," not the politicians, recognizing these past injustices. And in the middle, it both mandates you, Sharon, and I, and implores you and I to rectify these past injustices. And that this whole constitution actually rests on just 3 pillars. The first is this notion of a constitutional democracy. 2 beautiful words crafted together. It's like saying the development of managerial leadership. The second principle is that of social justice. The third is fundamental human rights, and there's 10 of them in Section 5 of our Constitution. Yes, there's freedom of association, the freedom of speech, but the one that's less sexy is the freedom from hunger. Therefore, for me, as I conclude, I think we need to accept that if South Africa is going to work, it's because business will make South Africa work. Because if we are going to wait for this ANC-led government, then we'll wait a long time, because it has demonstrated to itself that it is incapable of self-correction. But business must first accept that they have also agitated and orchestrated for state capture. Therefore, what is needed is to steer business back, because we can't speak of a just society when business is seen to be at the apex of injustice. What is needed now, more than ever, is incisive, decisive, bold leadership that only business can provide. Sharon.
Agreed, and thank you for that. Very, very profound words. I was at a business meeting today, and what my customer was talking about, it at a very low level between the taxi drivers and the bus drivers and the different territories of where people were moving people around, and how that had changed between different licensing conditions, and the corruption that came out because of minor changes, like you don't have to print your driver's license as frequently, or a license document for a vehicle is only printed less often, which means the printer loses out, somebody else loses out, somebody else loses out. And the conversation was actually quite fascinating on that spiral of corruption in a very small scale, but that's what's happening, is people are there for themselves and not for the greater good, and finding out what else they could do to earn a living that's correlated. They just go back to what they know. So sorry for that little piece there, but you've made me think about it, and it's so important that that leadership is brought to us. Gideon, you talked earlier about your research and the stage that an organization has to go through. We've all been through, virtually every company, most people, many of us have been in a position where there's an element of corruption we know about. It might have touched us. It's like crime. Most of us have had that touch with these things that we'd rather not have. But we've got to move our society forward. How do we stop, apologize, fix, move forward? Can you give us some advice from your research?
So I think the starting point is to recognize that the past profoundly shapes the present and the future. The German novelist Günter Grass spoke about the clogged up toilet of the past, which means to say that dealing with the past may be uncomfortable and even unpleasant, but if we don't do that, then it will mess up our present and our future. And I think, as I understand, that was the nature of the engagement between Peter and your firm. That you were essentially saying we can only move forward when we deal with the past. And that is the nature of corporate apologies. And of course, there have been a whole spate of them: Bain, Hogan Lovells, KPMG, McKinsey, EOH, and others. And they've offered apologies which I think have had different degrees of effectiveness. If you look at the literature, there are several components that are critical for an effective corporate apology. Starts off with acknowledging the wrong, which means to explicitly name the wrongdoing. This is a foundational step, and it's really important because it validates the victims. Morris spoke about the real, live, intergenerational consequences. People suffer. The first step is acknowledging the wrong. The second is admission of responsibility, which is to say accepting having committed the wrong. Now, this admission can be issued by the person who committed the wrong. It could be issued by the person who was in charge of those who committed the wrong. Or it could be issued by a person or people who represent an organization that committed the wrong, but is now accountable for fixing it. So there are both direct and indirect types of responsibility. This acknowledgement and this admission of responsibility is what distinguishes apologies from excuses, justifications, and denials. But it's not enough just to have acknowledgement and acceptance of responsibility. There also has to be a display of emotion. Scholars talk about emotions as being the engine of apology. In other words, the approach can't just be cognitive, it's also got to be effective. And the two emotions that are particularly important are remorse and empathy. Remorse is an expression of guilt for wrongful action, and empathy is defined as understanding from the injured person's perspective the damage done by the injury. To have that kind of empathy, I think, depends on having the mental and psychological space to see others and their pain. What's also important is restitution or reparation. And specifically, there needs to be some kind of material redress. Scholars talk about the difference between what they call cheap and costly apologies. There has to be some sort of compensatory or corrective action. It can't be a purely verbal apology. But while material redress alone, while material redress is important, alone it is insufficient because it can potentially create the impression that money settles moral debts and makes up for all sorts of wrongdoing. And so restitution has to be part of a kind of broader moral engagement. Finally, there has to be an approach that is forward-looking. There has to be a commitment to non-recurrence, a commitment, some kind of assurance that this won't happen again. So you have these different components that make up an effective apology. And what I would just say in summary is that in this work of addressing wrongs, you've got to deal with what I call the continuity of time, which is to say that you've got to deal with the past in order to enable a different future. But equally, when you enable a different future, you can somehow retroactively flood the past with meaning. And the sacrifices and sufferings of the past can acquire a different kind of significance.
Thank you. Very profound. Claudel, one of the things you talked about in your earlier speech when you were talking about culture, and you were talking about creating a safe environment for whistleblowers and people having the strength of their own ethics to stand up for what they believe in. Now, leaders in themselves are standing at the top, and they're putting their head over the parapet. And as we know, some people have got into very sticky positions. Some don't have their lives anymore. Some have just fought for their lives. So being a leader is one of the issues that we need to look at, protecting them so that they can do their job. We have the whistleblowers as well. How does that build into the corporate citizen and into the work that you do?
I think it's a core component. And so let's start with the leader. One of the things that I've started to reflect on more in recent times, and this is because of my executive coaching practice, the more you deal with leaders one-on-one, you start to realize what people are really having to deal with on a personal level, and that is fear. And our ability to look ourselves in the eye and to self-reflect and to see ourselves where we are is fundamental to us being good leaders. And more often than not, we find the ability to be honest with self is very difficult. And the self-awareness not really there that should actually be there. And so it's human nature to fear. Nature has put this part of our brain called the amygdala in our brain because it's an important survival tool that we need. It alerts us when there's a threat. But we often have an unhealthy relationship with fear. Either we become crippled with fear or we ignore the signs that something is wrong. So as leaders, I think it's very important that you have that self-reflection, but also collectively, to be able to have the conversations here in the boardroom. What are the things that are scary? And how we can move past the fear so that we can actually deal with it. And then when you have that comprehension at the level of self as a leader, you can then start to comprehend what the whistleblower goes through, because we often underestimate what whistleblowers go through. So what we have in organization is we've got a whistleblower policy, we've got a hotline, and that's about it. And the hotline and your policy is not protecting the whistleblowers. We don't train leaders, managers on how to deal with a whistle being blown in their office. Sometimes they expose the whistleblowers inadvertently because they don't know what the hell they're doing, because they're not being trained. So that's something that we've got to address in our organizations. We don't provide support to the whistleblowers. The psychological trauma that they go through is really a big thing, but we let them walk by themselves. And it's if you think about us as human beings, we're supposed to be social beings. We've got social brains. But when it comes to somebody speaking up in the organization, suddenly that person is alone. And we don't acknowledge to ourselves that we've been driven by fear. We don't address that so we can overcome it so that we can walk with the person who is the whistleblower. So are the leadership making sure that there is psychological support in addition to the protection? Protection is separate from support. Some whistleblowers don't need the protection, but they need the psychological support. So it's a full conversation that you've got to have. But it really starts with me as a leader, acknowledging I'm a human being, acknowledging where my fears are, addressing them so I can move past that and actually lead.
And be helpful and useful as a leader, because I have done all of those things. So I totally agree with what you're saying there. Really insightful, and I think the whistleblower thing is not just a South African thing. That's very much a global issue, that most whistleblowers end up turning into being consultants and dinner speakers or event speakers or motivational speakers, and they try and teach other people about it, but get a job, and people say, oh no, I don't trust you. And I think, why don't you revere the person who had that guts rather than victimize them for actually doing what is the thing you want most, is telling you what's wrong in your own business. Don't be fearful. Look after them. Make them important. Don't tell anybody about it, but make them feel protected. So I so go with you, and it's such a critical aspect of business. And you look at right up to politics, Trump got it wrong. We're getting it wrong here at the moment, where people want to know who the whistleblower is. It's the whole point of being a whistleblower. If I didn't want to be a whistleblower, I'd speak. Anyway, Peter, your turn. We've talked a couple of times this evening around that it's still happening. These things are still going on. I gave you a small story a few moments ago. Without naming and shaming anybody, are there some areas that you could sort of bring to light so people say, oh, I hadn't thought of that, so it can be helpful in their journey to a better place?
Well, thanks. First of all, picking up on Claudelle's point about whistleblowing, there's one whistleblower who's shown incredibly who's been incredibly brave, is paid with his job and has to flee the country. And that's Athol Williams. Now, every South African citizen in this room, every South African business with any substantial activity should be ashamed of themselves that you have a boy from Mitchell's Plain who rose to be one of the top corporate global management consultants in the world, working for one of the top firms, Bain & Company, blew the whistle on all of that, got hounded out of the country, threatened with his life, and is now jobless in the UK. You should be ashamed. And I think we should all take responsibility for making contact with him, as it happens I've done, but I'm in the UK, and find a role for him back in South Africa where he wants to be, that is safe and where he can do his job. That's one example. That is naming names. But I feel very strongly about this. It's a stain on every business in South Africa, on every business association in South Africa, that somewhere has not been found for Athol to be recognized because he's paid with he's sacrificed his old future and his wife and have had to be hounded out of the country. This is not apartheid South Africa. This is contemporary South Africa. Second example, by the way, one whistleblower, and you all know about this, who worked for the health department in Gauteng, paid for her life because of her bravery. This is outrageous. You cannot allow it to continue. And some of you need to do something about it.